June 14, 1993, northern coast of the Dominican Republic. The rain had stopped only minutes earlier. Water still dripped from the jungle canopy as archaeologist Kathleen Deegan stepped through the muddy excavation trench. The air smelled of wet earth and salt carried inland from the Atlantic. Workers had already uncovered pottery shards, fish hooks of bone, and fragments of woven cotton. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have changed history. Then one of the workers struck wood. Not driftwood, not roots, something shaped. The digging stopped immediately. Mud was brushed aside with trembling hands. Beneath the sediment lay the dark curve of a massive carved hull. The wood was ancient, waterlogged, almost black beneath the clay. At first glance, it looked impossible. The canoe was far larger than researchers expected for any pre-Columbian Caribbean vessel. And the deeper they excavated, the larger it became, nearly 40 feet long. Carved from a single giant tree trunk. No metal tools, no nails, no campes, no sals. The trench fell silent except for insects and distant waves, because everyone understood the same thing at once. People had crossed open ocean in this. Not coastal fishing routes, not short island hops. Open sea, hundreds of kilometers between islands. Violent currents, sudden tropical storms. Reefs sharp enough to tear apart wooden hulls in seconds. European sailors centuries later feared these waters even with advanced ships. Yet long before Columbus in 1492, the Taino and Carib had mastered them. And archaeologists still do not fully understand how. As researchers cleaned the canoe, new questions emerged. The hull showed signs of repair and repeated long-distance use. Residue analysis suggested transport beyond simple fishing supplies. Cotton, stone tools, ceremonial objects, even traces of exotic plants. Trade, organized trade. Across islands separated by dangerous ocean passages. If they regularly crossed between Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and the Lesser Antilles, then the Caribbean was not an isolated scattering of cultures. It was connected, alive, moving constantly. European chroniclers portrayed them as primitive island communities drifting in isolation. But discoveries like this told a different story, far more sophisticated. One historians had underestimated for generations. Excavations across Puerto Rico uncovered jadeite traced to Central America. Shell ornaments in Jamaica matched styles from Venezuela. Archaeologists found similarities in ceremonial plazas and burial practices across distant islands. The people of the Caribbean were communicating, traveling, exchanging ideas. But how did navigators without written maps or magnetic compasses travel so precisely? Modern experiments revealed many passages were far more dangerous than historians assumed. Some crossings involved powerful currents capable of dragging vessels off course. Others required precise timing with seasonal winds. A single mistake could send a canoe into endless open Atlantic. And still they sailed. Columbus himself seemed stunned when he encountered Caribbean canoes in 1492. His crew described vessels carrying dozens of people and large cargo. Some accounts suggested organized maritime highways already existed. But something strange hid inside those early descriptions. Columbus underestimated indigenous navigators while relying on their information. The canoe moved silently through the water. No engines, no campes, no lanterns. Only moonlight sliding across black Caribbean waves, more than 500 years ago. Imagine standing inside that narrow wooden hull. As the shoreline disappears behind you, the ocean stretches endlessly in every direction. Clouds cover the stars. Wind shifts suddenly. Beneath the canoe, deep currents pull invisibly through the dark. And yet the navigators did not panic. Because this journey had been made before, again and again. By the early 2000s, archaeologists began piecing together a hidden reality. A reality buried beneath centuries of colonial narratives. The ancient Caribbean was not a chain of isolated islands. It was part of a massive maritime network, operated by navigators who rivaled the great oceanic cultures of the ancient world. The evidence emerged slowly, one excavation at a time. At the Tibbs Indigenous Ceremonial Center in Puerto Rico, researchers uncovered artifacts from materials far beyond the island. Greenstone traced to Guatemala, copper linked to South America, distinctive pottery styles across islands separated by dangerous channels. These were not accidental drifts carried by storms. The patterns were consistent, intentional, organized. Something far more advanced had existed across the Caribbean Sea. Then researchers began studying the canoes themselves. Spanish accounts from the late 15th century described enormous dugout vessels, capable of carrying 40 to 50 people at once. Some had raised platforms protecting cargo from seawater. Others traveled in coordinated groups between islands. One observer compared them to Mediterranean trading vessels. That comparison shocked historians. For decades, scholars assumed pre-Columbian Caribbean lacked maritime technology. But experimental archaeology challenged that assumption dramatically. In 2008, researchers reconstructed Taino canoes using ancient methods. Trunks were hollowed with controlled burning and stone tools. The process took weeks, sometimes months. The finished vessels were heavy yet remarkably stable in rough water. Modern crews tested them in open sea conditions. The canoes performed far better than anticipated. Skilled paddlers maintained impressive speed against strong currents. The narrow hulls sliced efficiently through Caribbean swells. Their flexibility absorbed wave impacts without splintering. Suddenly, long-distance voyages no longer seemed impossible. But one mystery remained. How did they navigate without instruments? Some used mental mapping based on stars, currents, winds, birds, and swells. A method as complex as how Polynesians crossed the Pacific. No written charts were needed. The sea itself became the map. Indigenous oral traditions described memorizing wave patterns. Swells reflected off coastlines, detectable by skilled sailors at night. Imagine finding an unseen island by how waves move beneath you. Some tracked cloud formations gathering above distant landmasses. Others observed seabirds leaving shore at dawn and returning at dusk. Seasonal winds shifted predictably, creating maritime corridors. The navigators were not fighting the sea. They were working with it. The storm arrived without warning. Dark clouds rolled across the Caribbean horizon faster than the paddlers could react. Waves slammed against the sides of the canoe. Rain erased the stars. Wind howled across open water so violently that even modern fishing boats nearby turned back toward shore. And yet, according to oral traditions preserved among indigenous descendants in the Lesser Antilles, ancient navigators sometimes continued sailing through conditions like these. Not recklessly, deliberately. For historians, that claim became deeply controversial. By the late 20th century, the debate had split into two opposing camps. One side argued the voyages were simple coastal movements exaggerated over time. The other believed the Taino and Carib peoples possessed a highly advanced maritime tradition. The disagreement centered on a difficult question. Were these sailors merely surviving the Caribbean or mastering it? At the University of Florida and other research centers, scholars began comparing ancient trade routes with environmental data. Ocean current simulations revealed something surprising. Certain voyages once considered impossible aligned perfectly with seasonal flows, but others did not. Some routes crossed waters where currents moved against the direction of travel for most of the year. Navigators would have faced powerful crosswinds capable of pushing small vessels off course. Critics argued such journeys must have been accidental drift voyages, storm-blown migrations, pure lac. Yet that explanation created another problem. Accidental voyages do not produce stable trade networks lasting centuries. They do not create consistent cultural exchange between distant islands. They do not explain why similar religious symbols and ceremonial architecture appeared repeatedly across the Caribbean. The patterns suggested intention, precision, repeated contact. Then researchers uncovered evidence harder to dismiss. At sites in Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, isotopic analysis of human remains revealed unexpected truth. Individuals had spent parts of their lives on entirely different islands before relocating. These were not isolated cases. Some communities showed clear evidence of regular migration over generations. Families, traders, possibly even navigational specialists. The Caribbean was not simply inhabited. It was interconnected. Entire cultural identities evolved around maritime travel. And still, nobody could fully explain how these navigators maintained orientation in open ocean. One theory focused on astronomy. Some researchers proposed Caribbean sailors used star paths similar to Polynesian navigation. By memorizing where stars rose and set, navigators could estimate direction at night. The idea sounded plausible, until another problem emerged. Tropical storms and cloud cover often obscure Caribbean skies for long periods. Without instruments, maintaining a precise heading becomes extraordinarily difficult. So perhaps the stars alone were not enough. Other scholars turned their attention to the sea itself. Marine anthropologists discovered seafarers can detect subtle wave interference patterns caused by nearby islands. To an untrained observer, the ocean appears random. To a master navigator, it contains hidden information. There were also whispers of something harder to prove: mental mapping. Indigenous oral histories describe navigators memorizing island chains through songs and chants. Directions were not written. They were performed aloud, embedded in memory. Navigation in the ancient Caribbean was not merely technical skill. It was cultural inheritance, a living archive carried by human minds. But colonial violence shattered indigenous societies with horrifying speed. Languages disappeared, rituals collapsed, navigational traditions died with the people who carried them. Several indigenous stories speak of roads in the sea that could only be traveled during certain times. How far did these sailors truly travel? Some artifacts suggest contact zones reaching deep into South America. Perhaps ancient Caribbean sailors were among the great maritime cultures of the ancient world, forgotten because their knowledge vanished before anyone understood what they had achieved. The canoe was never supposed to survive. That was the first thought marine archaeologists had when divers descended near Cuba's southern coast. Early 2000s, ancient Caribbean vessels were carved from wood. Organic, fragile, easily destroyed by salt water, storms, and time itself. After centuries beneath the sea, almost nothing should have remained. And yet fragments did. Dark shapes buried beneath sediment. Curved wooden forms trapped inside oxygen-poor mud. Ghosts of forgotten voyages. Divers moved lights across the seabed and realized something unsettling. The remains were not isolated wreckage. Nearby lay evidence of repeated human movement through these waters. Trade goods, worked stone, fishing tools. Traces of settlements aligned with coastal launch points. The ocean had preserved pieces of a vanished network. But only pieces. That is what continues to frustrate historians today. The story of ancient Caribbean navigation survives mostly in fragments, too incomplete to fully reconstruct. Canoe here, a trading artifact there, colonial descriptions by outsiders who barely understood what they witnessed, like trying to rebuild an entire civilization from shadows. Yet even those shadows reveal something extraordinary. Long before European empires crossed the Atlantic, indigenous Caribbean navigators were already moving through dangerous waters. With astonishing consistency, they connected islands separated by storms, reefs, and open ocean, using methods modern historians still debate. The greatest mystery is not how little they achieved, but how much. Every decade, new discoveries push back against older assumptions. In the Bahamas, organized inter-island trade existed far earlier than believed. In Puerto Rico, LiDAR scans revealed massive settlement systems hidden beneath vegetation, populations large enough to sustain extensive maritime economies. Along Venezuela and the Lesser Antilles, ceremonial objects traveled hundreds of kilometers. Across open sea, the scale keeps expanding. So does the mystery. Columbus described enormous canoes carrying dozens of people between islands. Spanish chroniclers mentioned local navigators guiding Europeans through dangerous waters. But colonial narratives reframed indigenous societies as technologically inferior. Why? Maritime cultures are notoriously difficult to preserve archaeologically. Wooden boats decay. Coastal settlements vanish beneath rising seas. Hurricanes erase physical traces generation after generation. Entire chapters of Caribbean history may rest underwater beyond recovery. What if the most advanced knowledge was never written down at all? Navigation was taught through apprenticeship, memory, ritual, and oral instruction. Knowledge remained alive only as long as each generation survived to pass it forward. In the Caribbean, colonization shattered that chain with catastrophic speed. Diseases killed enormous portions of indigenous populations within decades. Entire languages disappeared. Communities collapsed. A science carried inside human memory vanished almost overnight. The islands were already connected for centuries, possibly millennia, through invisible highways of water, navigated by sailors who mastered stars, currents, and winds. If so much knowledge disappeared, how much of the ancient world's understanding has been lost forever?